What is going on, and welcome to Wired to Hunt. I'm Jake Hofer, and this week we have Jack Huston with Midwest Deer Surveys. Jack has flown over 500 farms, and we talk about some of the observations he's been able to make from habitat, deer density, where mature bucks are living, the impact of insects, and how it may correlate with healthier deer. So we cover a lot of different topics here on Wired to Hunt, presented by Moultrie. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Here we go. Jack, welcome to Wired to Hunt.
Thanks for having me, Jake. Looking forward to today.
Absolutely. So just to rip the Band-Aid off here, I think you have flown and observed more farms than probably anyone else in the United States, and have surveyed more farms than anyone else. How many farms are you up to now, roughly?
I've done right around 500. Yeah, 3 years, 16 states roughly from, Western Pennsylvania all the way to Western Kansas, from Minnesota down to Florida. So, and everywhere in between.
So, okay, a lot of different farms. And, just in passing, a lot of people bring up everyone wants to form an opinion on thermal drones because I think it's a pretty fascinating piece of technology. There's, I think, from the deer survey, I feel like people fully kind of buy into what you're doing there. But then there's the question of abuse and the question of the technology in the space that often comes up. But one parallel I will draw for everyone is you're basically conducting scientific research on a micro scale for every single farm. And then you can take all that data and form all these different trends that you see across the whole country in over 500 farms or almost 500 farms. And whenever there's a new GPS study that comes out by MSU, I'm the first one reading it. Probably not the first one, but it's something that you want to read, what is the deer behavior? What are they doing? And just trying to learn to apply it to your own form of hunting and all these different things. And you're doing that on steroids. And so that's kind of where I'm positioning this conversation is I'm looking at this from a research perspective, a live version of a GPS study. Someone can argue with me, say it's not the same, but that's where my head's at. What do you think about that parallel?
It's deer data, right? Who doesn't love that? I think I take it real serious and in tracking everything well, location, numbers, breakdown, all that stuff. I've had a lot of people reach out. They're interested in getting access to that data, which I think is really cool. And one day I'll kind of release that as a large set. But there's so much to learn, right? Because research is, in captive herds and all that's one thing, but actually seeing it across the country, what changes where, what's actually going on is really cool. And it really wasn't possible. The thermal drone just allows us to take a step that we couldn't do before.
Yeah. I think another thing too, it's the most relatable deer information, deer data, because you're flying a variety of different farms, right? Different sizes, different regions, different habitat types, where often the GPS data, I enjoy reading and learning about it, but it's usually on a specific scientific site. Maybe it's 6,000 acres that is partially allowed, there's hunting, or maybe there's no hunting. And it's well, how can I compare if I have 40 acres or I hunt track a public that's 200 acres to that GPS data where you're able to see the different density and behaviors and how they bed that's applicable to more people than a specific scientific site. So I'm not dogging what they do because I find it really interesting, but this is the most relatable data I think across the board that you're going out there and seeing.
Yeah, it's what's actually going on in the real world. I feel like I've got a pretty large sample size now, so it's cool to actually, once you get enough, you can really start to see a few trends that maybe I had never thought about before, or things you just didn't think were possible, or all that stuff. And we're gonna dive into that today, but there's a few.
Yeah, what surprised you most early on when you were just starting? Let's say at milestone farm 100. So you have a lot of farms under your belt, and what you've been able to see in those first 100 farms. What was really shocking or surprising that conventional wisdom would have told you differently, but you were able to observe like, oh man, I didn't realize this was the thing.
It's unbelievable how many deer are out there in certain parts of the country. I've worked for some state agencies in the last year and flew with them. I said, "How many deer do you think we're going to find today?" And say their number, and I said, "How many deer do you think is the most possible we'll find?" And then they tell me, and we'll find 25% more than that. So they're just mind blown. There are a lot of deer out there in certain parts of the country, not so much in others. I would say, talk about social stress a lot, but just how important that is, how that plays into growing bigger deer, optimizing your herd, all that. But I think we're going to dive into it. Density rings, that's probably the biggest, Jake.
Hmm.
That applies. I don't think it matters if you're hunting 40 acres of public or you got a 5,000-acre farm in Iowa. Density rings play out everywhere. I do a survey, and I think hunters can use understanding them can really help anybody anywhere.
So for someone that's never heard of this, what is a density ring? Like, what do you mean by that?
So across if we just take a 20,000-foot view of a county or a township or whatever, there's changing densities among that landscape. So there might be a dense pocket in this 40-acre patch of timber here or this ridge. And usually, it's not just 10-acre little spots. We're talking a little bigger than that. But there's less deer here, there's more deer here, simply put. So that we can't really see that. But the drone does allow us to see that. And I see that on surveys all the time. And how does that affect deer? Um, there's a social aspect with the whitetail that we can't really see from a stand, that they know there's a lot of deer over there. They know this buck's over there. And so that influences how they act and where they want to be. Um, and I found, density rings are kind of the base level of it is the does are more in the higher density areas, and then the bucks are kind of outside that. And then even further, some of the biggest bucks in the area are usually 1 to 2 to 3 miles away from the highest density area. So it's kind of there's a localized density ring of the does might want to be here closest to this food plot that's in the center of the farm and the best. And then a quarter to a half mile away, you start finding a lot higher density of bucks. But then there's also, look at it from further up, 2 to 3 miles away is where the biggest buck in the whole township or area of that county might be, because they just want to be away from all the ruckus, I guess. We're
Hmm.
still trying to figure it out. I talk with a lot of people about it, um, but that's been really cool to see. And if you understand, here's where a lot of deer are. Here's some good cover 1 to 2 miles away. Maybe I can get a spot there. I've seen over and over again. Those are the best spots to get the biggest and best mature bucks.
It seems almost counterintuitive to like I'm just picturing in my head, one farm that's highly managed, bunch of food, really good cover, and then in my mind, and I could be wrong, and you can tell me, I'm picturing like a ditch with maybe 20 acres of cover, 2 miles away is could be a better spot, is what you're telling me, or is that at least for where that deer lives?
Absolutely. I mean, there's some. I love my clients. I would never do this, but there's some of my clients where I wouldn't want to be on their fence, even though that might be kind of the logical. Oh, this is a really good farm. I want to be right here. I'd want to be 2 miles away, somewhere most people would never think, but that actually ends up being where that 180 is killed or where that 200 is killed. And then that really good habitat on that great farm, they got a lot of deer, but they just don't maybe have the quality they're wanting.
That's interesting. What So if you had to say where you're finding the highest concentration of mature bucks, and this is more like habitat related, in association to the density rings. I mean, is it pretty consistently like 2 or 3 miles away from wherever? Like, imagine for someone that doesn't have a thermal drone or doesn't, they're just trying to figure this out. Like, if you drive by and you're like, man, there was 20 does out in that field, that's crazy. And the next logical thought would be, okay, based off what Jack's learned and seen, what's another block of cover 2 miles away? And that might be the place where you can find a higher density of mature bucks, not necessarily near the field where you see a bunch of deer.
Yeah, I mean, you can just play around on Onyx. It's great. It's what I do, and um, you can, it doesn't always hold true that every single block of cover 2 miles away is there's going to be a giant deer,
Mm-hmm.
but it does hold true that those bigger deer are in one of those blocks of timber 2 miles away,
Mm-hmm.
or a draw or whatever. But yeah, you can play around on Onyx, and once you see one or two, then you can really start to pick up on, okay, I think he'll be here, and a lot of
Well,
factors. But
how does that conversation often go with someone, like, I don't own 1,000 acres, but we can pretend I do for a second. I hire you, and you're flying, and then let's say I own a satellite farm 2 miles away, and they're like, oh man, I've worked really hard over the last 15 years, and this farm has a bunch of deer, but the little ditch farm I bought on a second thought is better. Has that happened, or like, what is the conversation for them? Because like anyone that has like a core farm, they spend a lot of time, a lot of money, a lot of effort, a lot of energy, and like, man, is all this for nothing?
it's unbelievable. And I do work for a lot of people that kind of have their main farm. That's their baby. That's where they do all the habitat work. But if you look at where they actually kill their deer, their biggest deer, maybe half or less than half are actually there. And you would think that every single one would be there. But if they have access, they have a lease over here. A lot of times that's where they're actually getting their bucks. If you look at it 15, 20 years, mark mark it down, track it. But I tell them, if you're not going to take your herd management serious and get your numbers down here, you're just, honestly, all this work is benefiting the neighbor more than you,
Hmm.
your
And,
neighborhood.
and so let's run through that example. Let's say someone listening to this has an 80, a 120, whatever it is, or just a honey hole permission spot where there's a bunch of deer. What is typically your suggestion? Let's say number one, what is the density of, like, okay, yeah, you have too many deer for this block. Like, quantify that, and then maybe walk through an example of a prescription of, like, you need to shoot X percent of does for how long, and like, what do you anticipate, how long until you see a return from doing that? Because I mean, honestly, shooting a bunch of does is a lot of work.
It's an
Like,
unbelievable amount of work.
so let's walk through that.
So typically on, let's call it, I'm not saying a 150-acre farm is a small farm, but 150 acres and less, you just battle the problem less. You don't have as many acres. You can't get just in terms of the math of the totality of numbers, it can't get as bad there. So you want to have great habitat. And then, ideally, if we could do a survey, right, we can get an idea of the herd. I kind of understand most neighborhoods. We can understand a little bit about the neighborhood, what the dynamics are there. And then, really, you want to create a different density dynamic on your farm that's more favorable towards bucks. So, what do I mean by that? Well, simply put, if you get rid of does and bucks you don't want to be there, you make it a lot better scenario for a buck that you do want to be there to move in. So, and that's social stress. We're eliminating social stress, which makes that farm more attractive to the kind of buck that we want to kill. If you just kill does, just take the coal bucks out of it. Over time, what you're going to see is your buck to doe ratio is just going to get better. Seen that over and over again. Talk about Bill Winke's old Iowa farm a lot, but he killed 50 does a year for years on end, and he says at the end of it, he had a three buck to one doe ratio. And that's because as you take some of the does away, maybe they move in at a 1-to-1 rate, but after you do that so long, then you're left with a bunch of bucks,
Hmm.
um, which does make it more attractive for a bigger buck to be there. But jumping back to your question, Jake, not to go on a tangent there. Um, if I had an 80 or 120, I want to make the habitat great and keep the numbers low, and that's going to make it a great scenario for the kind of bucks we want to be there to make their home there.
So how do you make it the conundrum? I think a lot of people are thinking of like, man, if I have year round food and like it become and maybe the surrounding area does not have as high quality of habitat or high quality year round food, how do I keep that balance and kind of manage the 640, we'll say the square mile on my 80 to where it's like more than likely the does are going to be want to be on this farm because it's the best little 80 in this block. Is there a way to do it from what you've seen, or like have you seen anyone do a really good job of it?
It's very hard to be the central density farm. Like you talked about, just being by far and away the best habitat in the area. If you're going to battle high deer numbers, just because you're always going to have that problem. That's kind of why I like being in a little better overall habitat area, because then I'm not going to have such a draw that I'm going to have to fight every single year.
Hmm.
Um, I would say even if you are a big draw, that you still want to keep your numbers down. Um, Deer will move in, there'll still be plenty, but those bucks are always going to push out. It doesn't matter even if your overall numbers are low; they're always going to push out to the edge.
Mm.
And recently did a survey on Bill Winke's farm for the third year in a row, and he has very low numbers. But almost all of the bucks we found were on the edge of our survey area. So even
Mm.
though he's got low numbers and great habitat, all of the bucks still are on the edge because there's this social dynamic between deer where the does are going to be in the best spot, the bucks are going to be on the edge, even if there's not that many overall.
That's fascinating when you think about it. It's I'm almost speechless. Like, what is the right way to do it then? If you want the deer to live on you, it's like is doing nothing better than doing everything? Because there's been this movement of like, you know, you could tune into any podcast ever, and like you got to have diversity, you got to have the best habitat, you got to have this, you got to have that, and then it's like, well, yeah, that's obviously great, and will make potentially more opportunity to kill the buck that you're wanting when he shows up. 100% agree with that. But it's like even if you do all the management and you don't have a big enough piece, like they're still going to end up probably on the outskirts or edge. And I could be looking at this wrong. So like you've seen this, I haven't.
No, it's very true, Jake. I was in Iowa last week with a landowner who's killed a lot of 200-inch bucks, and he's got a lot of acreage. And he said, "Jack, I'm almost just 100% done with the food plots because it was better before I ever started doing them." And he's
Mm.
talking about 30-acre alfalfa fields and all of this stuff because he understands just it's a huge draw, and that pushes the deer out.
Outward.
Yeah, I mean he had a great deer that got pushed 3/4 of a mile away and got harvested by a neighbor, which is great. But we were talking about how that probably happened
Hmm.
because he's just too populated.
Did he say what he would replace those food plot acres with? Like, is it more habitat, or is it just like throw the keys to the wind and let nature reclaim the ground?
We were talking about filling it in with warm season grasses, but or just plain tillable.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I've seen where people like through selling land, like people go in, they fix up this farm, and like it was maybe pretty raw before they had bought it, and then it's like all of a sudden the neighbors are like, oh my gosh, we hadn't killed a big deer in a long time, and it's like I've seen that happen time and time again, where raw piece gets improved, and then the neighbors reap the benefits of it, and that's not dogging the situation whatsoever, but like that's just a trend I've seen to some degree, and that follows with what you've been seeing with how the deer actually behave, and it's just interesting. It's like it's a lot to process, Jack.
Yeah, and I would say all I've learned if I'm buying a farm, what I'm going to look for is I would never want to be in the area that's going to constantly draw deer in. So that's that. You look at satellite, that's the 1 or 2 thousand acres that you're like, that's the place to be. And I still believe in habitat management. What I would want to do is go 1 to 2 miles away from that in marginal habitat that maybe can only support a few deer now, make it really awesome, um, make it way more desirable to deer, and kind of start at that low level and keep it at a medium level, and you're just never going to have to battle it like you would on the other places.
Hmm. Here's a question for you. For someone you mentioned you flew for a state agency and had 25% more than what they thought they would have. So, assuming that trend may kind of go across the board for everyone, and they don't have a thermal drone, and sorry, Jack, they're not going to hire you because they don't have a big enough farm. But like, what are some things that would tell you that there is too much deer or too much like you're the incubator farm here right now, and but you don't know that, like, what are some key indicators that would maybe tell you that, okay, maybe we need to readjust strategy, maybe we need to start managing some does. It's been 5 years since we shot a doe off this farm, like something like that. Like, what are some either deer behavior or on the landscape indications that there's too many deer or there's too much social stress?
Yeah, we can start with. I got a couple obvious ones, and then a couple that probably people have never thought of, but I picked up on. You could start with food. Is there a big browse line in the woods? Well, that's probably an indication that there's just too many deer. Too many deer there. Food plots. A utilization. I forget what it's
Utilization
called,
cages.
but yeah, utilization
Yep.
cages. Those are great. You get to see how much is that food plot really getting browsed down. I mean, if it's nipped like that, it's either need to plant more food or you've probably got too many mouths. Just deer body condition going into this time of year, March, April. That's a great indicator. A prolonged rut. Um, I've seen many deer rutting in January and February doing these surveys, which is something that I didn't really know happened before, but it very much so does. Those doe fawns come into heat. Um, and one thing I picked up on, if your bucks are holding super late consistently year over year, that means you have a very out of whack buck to doe ratio.
So say that again.
Because that
So I just got a picture of a buck still holding both antlers yesterday. So tell me what that means.
Okay. Well, one off, I'm not talking about one or two
Yeah.
bucks, but if you consistently have bucks the second week of March across all age classes holding, um, that's not a good sign. It means you have an out of whack herd. And actually, there's a balance to this because stress deer shed early, stress bucks shed early. But actually, um, if I would say if all your bucks shed the third week of January, that would be a really healthy herd. You actually want them to shed earlier in a way. That means you have a more balanced herd. And I've talked with some landowners who have gone extremely aggressive on harvesting does, and one of them comes to mind in particular. He had found almost every buck shed by the second week in January, and we do a survey. He's got 3 bucks to one doe on 1,000 acre sample size, and he says,
Hmm.
"Jack, it's 100%. This never happened before we started implementing the aggressive doe harvest, and it's because there's no more does to breed, and so they drop earlier." He had also mentioned
So,
to me he had spoken with Dr. Woods about that, Dr. Grant Woods. So
mhm.
something I'd never
so
heard, but
no, that's pretty interesting. So for if bucks are still holding the second week of March, you think, you correct me if I'm wrong, but the reason why they might be holding into the second week of March is because there's so many doe fawns going into estrus, and so their testosterone stays higher longer, and it like prolongs that period or like changes the natural rhythm.
Yep, 100%. One more quick example. I flew kind of a big residential real estate development place that was having big problems with deer and landscaping. Some of the members have gotten alpha gal, so they had way too many deer. So they called me in to do a survey. Well, this was the first week of March. We found 1,100 deer total, and only 80 of them were bucks. Now, what's crazy is you would think that's an extremely unhealthy herd, but probably 75% of those bucks that looked as run down as you could ever be still had their antlers.
That's really interesting. There was
That was
1,100 deer, 1,100 deer and 80 bucks. Is that
80
what you said?
bucks, yeah, and one mature buck, yeah,
How big? How roughly? How large was that sample size?
7,000 acres.
Okay, that's crazy, dude.
Yeah, about 5,000 a habitat. So that population, um, if I were to look at that habitat, I would say it should probably support about 40 to 50 per square mile. It was really poor habitat,
Mm-hmm.
but it was holding the 125 per square mile. And those numbers were just going up like crazy because they were kind of protected in the neighborhood.
Wow. How? Why? So okay, and that. Did you want to fly like 2 or 3 miles away to see how many big bucks you could find? Did that cross your mind?
It would be interesting, yeah. I don't know if that would be the case there or what. That's kind of an extreme example, but
Yeah.
there probably are some great bucks on the edge there. I mean, you would have
Yeah.
to imagine there's a huge crash in during the rut there.
Mm-hmm.
So many does coming in the heat. What happens? But
Yeah. Wow. So 75% of them are still holding their antlers first. Was that in the Midwest, or was that like just for reference?
yeah,
For
that was in Missouri, northern
okay.
Missouri.
So yeah, they definitely more than 75% should have been shed by that point. That's really interesting. I've never heard of that. What are they going to do with the deer? With that many deer, like, are they going to have some sort of program to allow hunting? Or, I mean, okay, so in that extreme scenario, how long does it take to course correct something like that, or can you course correct it from a
You
biology
can. I
standpoint?
mean, that's a unique scenario just because I mean, there's people living there, and
Mm-hmm.
it's not just you're out in the country. Um, it kind of depends on how aggressive you get with the harvest. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think you could course correct in 2 or 3 years if you hit it really hard, but just taking 10% every year wouldn't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what you
Assuming,
do the numbers on that, that's a lot of deer.
I mean, that's a crazy amount of deer. Assuming if you did shoot 10%, that's 100 some deer every year. And what have you been seeing, like relating back to Winky's farm, since you've flown it for a few years, and because he's been actively shooting does, or at least I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, he was like, every chance I get to shoot a doe, I'm going to shoot one. What have you been able to observe from that? Because I you've been on the farm, I haven't. You've seen it. Like, what from your conversations with Bill, and what is the trajectory of the current plan that he has? Because I feel like a lot of people could potentially relate to wanting to reduce doe numbers, and what is the positive of it, and then what's the potential negative of it if fawn recruitment isn't great, or like all these different factors that go into this.
I've never seen anybody overdo doe harvest.
Really?
Not once. I've never, even after giant EHD kill offs, I've never seen anybody overdo it. Now, I think doing the survey for Bill was great because he's gung ho about getting on the does, and we kind of learned after 3 years of history that he probably needs to build his numbers up a little bit. or at least keep them where they're at. He's not battling that problem like many landowners are. Um, his plan is, he's kind of come to the conclusion that he doesn't have the best genetics in that area, which
Hmm.
is a huge, huge factor in growing bigger bucks. He's going to try to kind of hit it hard on culling some bucks if he can, taking those genetically, inferior deer out. But really, it's just continuing with the habitat. Um, it's such a unique scenario there that it was such a blank slate that he told me this year that he was there in January. The year he bought it in January, he didn't even see a deer track. So he's going from zero to what he is now, and just continuing on that progression. There's
Hmm.
not a whole lot he can do on the herd management side, just because he's not too high on deer numbers, which is kind of rare for my customers.
Hmm. So, which would you rather have? You have to reduce, like, what's a better scenario for someone listening right now? Like, solid genetics, create, 20%, 30% more deer on the landscape, or 40% more deer on the landscape than what there should be, or the opposite of lower density with not the best genetics. Like, what is a easier thing to potentially improve, in your
Genetics
opinion?
or herd size?
So yeah, good genetics, way too many deer, way too many deer, or poor genetics, not a ton of deer. And so, like, can you, in your opinion, from flying over multiple years, do you think that someone could improve the genetic? I don't want to say like improve the genetics, but selectively harvest to where if you have 5 bucks, one of them has some potential, 4 of them are junky. It's a very complex question, but hopefully you get what I'm getting at.
Oh, I would way rather have too many deer and great genetics.
Hmm.
We don't talk about it a lot in the deer world, but I've learned that. I think having good genetics is. That's the biggest thing to growing big deer. It really is. You have to have it. Some places don't. Some places do. I do think you can make a difference on genetics. We've seen, you and I know Don, and Don's talked a lot about over the last couple of years how he's changed the genetics on his farm, but that took 20 years, and it's
It's a long
that's
time.
just very, very hard for anybody to realistically implement. I think it can be done, but it's such a long time horizon. So I would way rather have high deer numbers and bring those down, because that's
Hmm.
actually doable in the short term.
Have you noticed any trends where, correlation of good genetics and different regions, different habitat types, river systems, like anything that you're like, okay, typically the better genetics are in these three categories, or is it completely random for the most part?
There's some randomness to it. I was There's a couple parts of Iowa that are head scratchers for me in terms of like, this is the most beautiful farm I've ever been on in a great area you would think is a great area, and they just don't have the genetics that are 20 miles away. Um, I would say it really sticks out in like Kansas, because in Kansas, especially as you get more western, you have drainages. That's where the cover is. That's where the deer are. And then you go 10 miles away, there's kind of nothing in between. The deer really aren't traveling maybe in between. And then there's another drainage. Well, the genetics are different 10 miles up here on this river versus 10 miles down here on that river. And you want to be on that river and not the one above it. So they definitely do follow in the kind of extreme scenarios like that where they're separated, isolated. Uh, they follow those rivers. There's
Mm.
some rivers in Kansas that are, I won't name drop spots, but it's like you need to be on that place, but you go 10 miles away on the next river that looks the same, and it's just not as good. And that's 100% genetics.
Yeah. Well, that's the type of information that wasn't available. Like, someone local that maybe grew up their whole life, would have figured that out, I think. But to have like the hard data and observation is pretty crazy that you're able to do that. Um, talking about Kansas and you had mentioned that the gentleman with a bunch of food plots to potentially put in warm season grasses. We had talked about warm season grasses on the Whitetail podcast, and it ruffled some feathers. Have you changed your position or thoughts on warm season grasses in terms of deer habitat? Because it's a quick way to get cover on the landscape, and I think that's really attractive for a lot of people.
They've really grown on me. I will say, a lot of my surveys are kind of November 1st through now into April. And I very, very rarely find, a significant amount of deer bedded in warm season grasses, switchgrass, all of that stuff. Um, do they use it early season? They do. It's definitely more utilized in the summer months and early fall. I think it's much less preferable than, say, well cut timber that's really thick. Um, that being said, I think warm season grasses and switchgrass, they add depth to a farm that's super helpful. They add thickness to a farm that's super helpful. I think they limit some deer interaction, which is social stress, which is great. Some of the best farms I've seen, like on their road frontage, they have really thick grasses so nobody can see in there. And I think that's extremely valuable.
Mm-hmm.
Some places much more so than others, but I think they're great for fawn recruitment. I've noticed a huge increase in turkey numbers in areas that have a lot of CRP or switchgrass, just because I think their nesting is a lot better. So I think there's a lot of benefit for wildlife in having it. The problem is people look at it as the best deer bedding on their farm when it is absolutely not that.
Mm. So the follow up is, what is the typically the best for the November surveys, and specifically like in November, where are bucks bedded as a rule of thumb, as a general idea?
In November, if they're with a doe, they're going to be kind of isolated. They might be in switchgrass because that's really isolated out there, but don't necessarily see that super common. They're in ditches, they're in draws, they're in big timber way back. They're just by themselves, or they've got a doe back there. But it's it can be kind of random, Jake.
I was afraid you
Situation
were going to say
dependent.
that. I was afraid you were going to say it was going to be random, because that's how November often feels, random. So that tracks for sure. Um, what have you
Thicker
noticed? Because
cover,
what?
yeah,
Thick. So
thicker cover, yeah,
yeah.
thicker cover with some form of isolation is where big bucks are going to be bedded.
Hmm. What is, everyone has a different definition of thick. On some of these, when everyone's like, "Oh, you need to thicken up the timber," or "You need to, do TSI," you need to, open up the canopy. Like that's, I almost feel like it's a record album that gets on repeat. It's like that is a common theme of, if you want to hold more deer, hold more bucks, you need to have a thicker farm. Is that something that you have seen?
100%. Making your farm thicker. Let's start with the timber. Does two things. It makes the deer. It limits the social interaction. So in a way, it kind of boosts your ability to hold deer. But it makes, if your farm's much thicker, even if you have the same amount of deer, that mature buck doesn't necessarily think there's the same amount of deer because he's seeing them less. Just so much thicker, you can hold more mature bucks. But it also adds a huge food component. Browse is the majority of a deer's diet in the Midwest, woody browse in the wintertime. So if you don't have that on your farm, you're not going to hold deer in that time of year.
Hmm.
I would almost say I used to think that browse was the much bigger part of doing timber stand improvement, but I really do believe now that it's just the thickening of it that
Security
makes
cover.
it. Yeah, it's such an attraction for bucks. And then you jump into the grass side. I mean, we've all seen big, tall fields of warm season grasses, that stuff's thick. So
Mhm.
it just creates depth, thickness.
Have you flown a farm where they're like, all right, security cover, I'm going to make it thick? Have you seen an instance where it's just simply too thick and you fly the drone and it's like, this is a deer desert because it's too thick. They can't work through it. Or is there such thing as too thick from what you've seen from the air? Like, I understand you're not in there like walking every square inch of these farms at all, but just from the air, what have you observed?
I would say the only, invasive species are the only way that that's going to become a possibility. So your bush honeysuckle, your autumn olive, your multiflora rose. If you're going to open up a bunch of sunlight to let those species flourish, there's a possibility that it may become too thick. Sure, you see that in some Illinois,
There's some bush
but
honeysuckle here.
those viney and thorny plants can become, and you just can't walk through them, and neither can a deer.
hmm So no such thing as too thick as long as it's good habitat of thickness. Like all thick timber is not created equal is what I'm picking up.
Correct. Yeah, I think if you have all great species, and I'm not a forestry expert, but if you clear cut a forest with no invasive species and you just let it grow up, I don't think it becomes too thick for deer.
Hmm. Okay. Interesting. Is there an example of a farm? And I don't, if this guy listens, I feel bad. But is there an example of a farm where, like, dude, this farm is a total, like, I'm picturing like a house, right? Like, oh, it's got good bones. You can do this. You can fix that. And then there's some houses like it's not worth saving. Have you flown a farm where it's like this thing is really, really, really bad because of with these key elements?
Absolutely. I mean, you start with neighborhood, right? If you're in the wrong neighborhood and you have a hunter every 40 yards on your fence, you can never. I don't think you can overcome that.
hmm
So in scenarios where that's possible, maybe moving is kind of your option there. In terms of habitat, I mean, there's certain scenarios that play out once you see enough farms where you can't make a difference.
hmm
Herd management, habitat management, you can't overcome that problem. Trying to think of some specific examples. Nothing too extreme comes to mind.
Okay. Did you fly any farms in Southeast Ohio this off season where
I
EHD
did.
was a major kill off? What'd you see?
I did. Yeah, I saw in southern Indiana, I think I did quite a bit of work there, and I think they've had some in certain pockets, at least from talking to the locals, pretty bad EHD. And the numbers were they were lower than I would have thought going in, but they weren't extremely low. Or I wouldn't even call them low. They were more what you might want to see. Now, I'm not talking about the hot spots where I'm sure it's very bad, but um, I've flown after quite a bit of bad EHD kill offs, and there's still quite a few deer there. The thing is, it's just a lot less than we're used to, and many times that's Mother Nature's way of kind of course correcting.
hmm
But I would say a typical non-major EHD kill off might kill 30% of the herd. We'll
Have
see that
you
on surveys.
have you flown a farm that was smoked by EHD? I'm just making these years up in 24, and then you flew it in 25 and 26. Have you seen what what's the trajectory of growth of if you haven't flown that, that's fine, but I'm just trying to see if, like, for those folks that are in Ohio where like, yeah, we got hit really hard, what can I potentially anticipate a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, if you've been able to document anything like that?
Well, I think they should be. I mean, I think good things are to come for them. Once you lower those numbers, you reduce that social stress. A lot of times, there's bigger deer to follow. There's one farm in Iowa where I've consistently flown it, and in the first year I flew it, they didn't think we were going to find 50 deer on the whole place, and we ended up finding 150, which was about 100 per square mile, which is actually a pretty high density. And they were shocked by that, and we flew it this year, and I mean it had probably gone up 50% in 2 years.
Mm, that's
So
interesting.
25% a year. What's interesting,
Mhm.
Jake, is we have this influx of fawns every year, and some populations, once they've reached kind of the holding capacity of the land, there's fawns that keep coming in, and there's hunting, hunters killing deer, but the populations kind of stay the same. It's X per square mile or X per acre. But on those growing deer populations like that one, they actually do. I mean, you can add up to 20-25% more deer year over year in those places that they're not at the holding capacity.
Mhm. We've talked very briefly in the past, but ticks and deer health. What's been your observations with that?
I think kind of Jack's bold prediction for something in the next 20 years is that we're going to have some big discoveries on ticks and deer, and maybe ticks and humans too. But uh, alpha gal is a term I'm just hearing more and more. That that place I flew for in Missouri, they had quite a few residents that had come down with it, and it was a huge deal. That's why I was there,
Mm,
was the spreading of alpha gal. And I think with deer, um, it's unbelievable how, I don't know how I track it, but there is some correlation between lots of ticks on deer and not as big of bucks.
mhm,
Um, and there's some areas I'll fly that 5 miles away I could go. There's a lot of ticks on the deer. I go this way 5 miles and there's no ticks on the deer. Well, why is that? Is there some genetic trait that's keeping them off? I'm sure the landscape has something to do with it, but there's not some giant difference in ticks 5 miles away. There shouldn't be.
mhm.
And if so, what's causing that? Um, I've had a lot of conversations about ticks and deer, and I think they make a bigger impact than we think. Even in a localized environment, if you go look at all your bucks on a given farm in, say, August, maybe this is just my head playing games on me. I feel like the better bucks just have less ticks than every other one in the bachelor group sometimes.
Hmm. So the question is, okay, if they're a bottleneck to a whitetail expressing, I mean, all whitetails expressing the healthiest version of themselves. It's like, okay, what eats ticks, turkeys? How do you reduce tick pressure? I would imagine, obviously, having good habitat for birds, for them to get ate by ticks, prescribed fire, I feel like would probably be another thing that you could put in your control. And then hopefully there's a biologist or someone listening to this smarter than the both of us. Like, all right, you want less ticks? This is the game plan. Maybe that'll be something that gets implemented more into the landscape. And everyone hates ticks, man. If you could tell me, all right, there's less ticks now, do this. I think everyone would do that.
I think I think fire, maybe warm season grasses could potentially help. Um, Fire is going to be your biggest one though,
Hmm.
and really just finding the area that doesn't have as many. I know that sounds dumb, but that's kind of the biggest thing.
100%. All right, let me, you need to rank these three things. You have to rank, I had a note here. If I specifically, okay, I want you to rank one, two, three, one being most important, three being the least important. Age structure, nutrition, or genetics for someone that wants to have the best ear possible. What is the most important? What's the least important of those three?
Genetics is number one by far, um, and people might kind of argue with me on that, but there's some bucks that they can make it to 7 or 8 years old, and they're never going to be more than a 130-inch 8 pointer. And the Milo Hansen buck was supposedly 3 years old when it got shot. So genetics by far number one. Second would be age, for sure. Um, a 1-year-old buck in the wild is 2-year-old buck in the wild will take the most extreme kind of into that. It's never going to have a giant rack. And then third would be nutrition. I
Interesting.
used to think nutrition was much more important than I've realized it is.
What's made you come to that realization? Is it flying deserts in Kansas that look like Mars?
Um, and yeah, deserts in Kansas. Yeah, that's a good way to put it, Jake. And those grow the biggest deer. Many times, biggest deer in the whole country sometimes. Um, but even you go to the southeast, you have a pine forest. There's nothing to eat, and you do a clear cut. You increase the food drastically. You put in acres and acres of food plot. So you went from zero food basically to as much food as you can realistically put, and you're only going to see, and I say only, but you're only going to see a 15-inch jump on your bucks on average.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you went from one end of the spectrum to totally on the other, and it made a great difference. But you know, maybe not as big as we'd hope. I think in the Midwest it's important to have good food plots and great browse, but there is a lot of great food just on the landscape that deer can make it by with.
Mm-hmm. What where do you think thermal drones? Where do you see thermal drones place in the world of whitetails? Personally,
I think they're a great tool to understand herd dynamics, study deer, um, collect all the data I'm collecting. You know, there's so much we don't know about populations and herd dynamics in the wild, and that's such a huge part of management. So
mm-hmm.
understanding that's really important. And I don't think there's a better tool for the job than a thermal drone. I think, on the recovery side, that's probably where it's most used. I would bet there's probably been 50,000 plus deer over the last 3 years that may not have been found without thermal drones. That's a huge number.
Mm-hmm.
And it's affected a lot of people and their enjoyment of hunting because they're able to recover that buck and not waste that resource. I do think there's a lot of potential for misuse, just because of the power of the tool, and that's up to us to manage it right. I don't have the answers on what the right legislation would be in terms of this or that, but hopefully we can come to that soon, and ultimately it's up to people actually following the rules, and there's always going to be bad apples, right? But
Mm-hmm.
um, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But I think they're here to stay, and I think they're a great tool for hunters and land managers across the board when they're used correctly.
Wonderful. Where if someone wants to reach out to you and they want to see what's on their farm and get a deer study, because I know when you fly it, you give them a full report and it's some tangible information for them to carry along and build a management plan. Where do people reach out to you?
MidwestDeerSurveys.com is our website. You can find all my info there, and then on social media, YouTube, all that stuff. Midwest Deer Surveys. You can find my info there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jack.
Thanks, Jake. Appreciate it.
All right, there you guys have it. Hopefully, you're able to get some insight that may impact how you scout for deer, how you manage your properties, the whole gambit. I really appreciate Jack taking the time and sharing his observations, because like I said in the very beginning of this episode, he has observed more farms than probably anyone else in terms of deer density, different trends, and it is a scientific paper on steroids with what he has been able to observe. So hope you guys enjoyed it. We will see you next time. See ya.